when 20-year-old Rosalie McKenna's roof collapsed in a Wyoming storm, leaving her and baby brother Henry with nothing but soaked belongings and a harsh winter approaching. A mysterious cowboy named Daniel Reed appeared with an offer that could save them both, or destroy the fierce independence she'd fought so hard to protect. But as the weight of responsibility threatens to crush her like the endless stars pressing down on the frontier darkness, will Rosalie discover that sometimes the heaviest burdens become lighter when shared with someone who understands the true cost of carrying them alone? Blood stained the white cloth as Rosalie McKenna pressed it against her palm, watching the red drops fall onto the wooden floor of their cabin in the Wyoming territory. The axe had slipped while chopping kindling in the early morning darkness of 1881, and now precious fabric meant for baby Henry's clothes was ruined. At 20 years old, she couldn't afford such mistakes. The wind howled outside their tiny home, rattling the loose boards that barely kept out the October cold. Henry slept in his makeshift crib, an old apple crate lined with her mother's quilts, while Rosalie counted their remaining supplies by candlelight. 3 potatoes, half a sack of flour, and enough dried beans to last maybe a week if she ate only once a day. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd skipped supper again to make sure Henry had enough milk. The cow had been sold months ago to pay for medicine that hadn't saved their parents from the fever. Now she mixed water with the last drops of canned milk, hoping the baby wouldn't notice how thin it tasted. Mama always said winter comes early to punish the unprepared, she whispered to the sleeping child, wrapping the bandage around her cut hand. But how could anyone prepare for losing everything at 19? How could anyone be ready to become mother and father to a baby while still feeling like a child herself? The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls where her father's tools still hung. She tried to use them, tried to fix the leaking roof and patch the broken window, but her small hands weren't strong enough. Every day brought new problems she didn't know how to solve. Henry stirred, making the soft sounds babies make when they're dreaming. She wondered what he dreamed about. Did he remember their mother's lullabies? Did he know their father's voice was gone forever? Or was his tiny mind filled only with hunger and cold and the constant worry that seemed to follow them like a shadow? Outside, something crashed in the distance. Probably another piece of the old fence blown down by the wind. She'd have to fix it tomorrow, somehow. Everything needed fixing, and she was running out of ways to make broken things whole again. The money jar on the shelf held only a few coins now. Not enough for winter supplies. Not enough for Henry's medicine if he got sick. Not enough for anything that might save them from the harsh months ahead. She'd sold everything worth selling. Her mother's jewelry, their good dishes, even the family Bible with its gold edges. Thunder rolled across the prairie, and she pulled Henry's blanket tighter around his small body. The storm was getting worse, and their roof had more holes than a kitchen strainer. Soon the rain would start dripping through, and they'd have to huddle in the corner where the ceiling still held. She'd been alone with Henry for 6 months now, ever since the fever took their parents in the same terrible week. 6 months of learning that love wasn't enough to fill empty stomachs or keep the cold away. 6 months of discovering that being brave on the outside didn't stop the fear from eating you up inside. The wind grew stronger, and somewhere in its howling voice, she heard her mother's words from that last day. "Take care of Henry, Rosalie. Promise me you'll keep him safe." She'd made that promise with tears streaming down her face, never knowing how hard it would be to keep. Now, as she listened to the storm outside and felt the walls shake around them, one terrible question echoed in her mind. What happens when love isn't enough to keep the people you care about alive? The sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning air like a knife, sending Rosalie's heart racing as she peered through the cracked window of their cabin. Nobody came this far out unless they brought trouble, and she'd learned to fear the sound of strangers approaching. Henry was fussing in her arms, hungry again, and she didn't have enough milk to calm him. A man on horseback came into view, leading a limping horse behind him. Even from a distance, she could see he was tall and lean, wearing a dusty brown coat and a hat pulled low over his face. His horse favored its left front leg, and the man walked beside it instead of riding, talking to the animal in low, gentle tones she couldn't quite hear. "Shoo, Henry," she whispered, backing away from the window. "Stay quiet." But the baby's cries grew louder, and she knew the stranger had heard them. Through the thin walls, she caught pieces of his voice. "Easy now. Won't hurt you. Just need water." The words sounded kind, but she'd learned not to trust appearances. Kind words could hide cruel intentions, especially when spoken to a young woman alone with a baby. She grabbed the shotgun from beside the door. It wasn't loaded, but the stranger wouldn't know that. Her hands shook as she held it, Henry still crying against her shoulder. Outside, the footsteps stopped near their well, and she heard the man talking to his horse again. "I know, boy. Hurt something fierce, doesn't it? We'll get you fixed up." The tenderness in his voice made her pause. Men who meant harm didn't usually speak so gently to injured animals. Still, she kept the gun ready as she crept back to the window. The man was kneeling beside his horse now, examining the hurt leg with careful hands. His hat had fallen back, revealing dark hair and a face marked by sun and wind. Henry's crying suddenly stopped, and in the silence, she heard her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The man looked up, scanning the area around their cabin, and she ducked below the window frame. Had he seen her watching? "Hello." His voice carried across the yard, polite but cautious. "Ma'am, I don't mean any trouble. Just wondering if I might water my horse at your well. He's gone lame and we've been walking for miles." She didn't answer, couldn't answer. Every story she'd heard about women alone on the frontier ran through her mind. Stories that ended with empty cabins and graves unmarked by stones. But the man didn't try to come closer. Instead, she heard him moving around near the well, and when she risked another look, he was drawing water in his cupped hands for his horse to drink. "There you go," he murmured to the animal. "That's better, isn't it?" Henry began to cry again, louder this time, and there was no hiding their presence anymore. The man looked directly at their cabin, and even from a distance, she could see concern in his expression. Not the calculating look of someone planning harm, but the worried face of someone who'd heard a baby in distress. "Ma'am," he called again, "is everything all right in there?" Child sounds upset. The genuine worry in his voice cracked something in her chest. When was the last time someone had asked if she was all right? When was the last time anyone had cared whether Henry was upset or hungry or cold? She found herself moving toward the door before she could stop herself. "Stay where you are," she called out, trying to make her voice sound strong and threatening. "I've got a gun." "Yes, ma'am. I'll stay right here by the well." He raised his hands slightly, showing he carried no weapon. "Name's Daniel Reed. I'm just passing through, heading for Cheyenne. Horse threw a shoe back on the trail, and he can't go much further without rest." Daniel Reed. The name sounded ordinary, harmless, but she'd learned that ordinary names could belong to dangerous men. Still, Henry was getting heavier in her arms, and her back ached from holding him so long. The gun was getting harder to grip with her bandaged hand. "What do you want?" she asked through the door. "Just water for my horse, ma'am. Maybe directions to the nearest town where I can get him shod. I'll pay for the water if that's your way." "Pay." The word hit her like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had offered to pay for anything? She thought of the nearly empty money jar, of Henry's thin milk, of the holes in their roof that let in rain and cold. "How much?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Whatever's fair. I've got coins." Her resolve wavered. They needed money so desperately, and he seemed genuinely concerned about his horse. Maybe some strangers could be trusted. Maybe not everyone who came to their door brought danger. But as she reached for the door handle, one question burned in her mind. Could she risk Henry's safety for a few coins, no matter how badly they needed them? "Put the gun down, Rosalie." The voice came from behind her, and she spun around to find Mrs. Hartwell standing in the doorway of the cabin, her gray dress spotless despite the long ride from town. The older woman's sharp eyes took in everything: the empty shelves, Henry's thin face, the bandage on Rosalie's hand, and her mouth pressed into a disapproving line. Rosalie's heart sank. Mrs. Hartwell was the kind of woman who believed young ladies should be married and protected, not living alone with babies they couldn't properly feed. As the preacher's wife, She had opinions about everything and the power to make those opinions heard by everyone who mattered. "Mrs. Hartwell," Rosalie stammered, lowering the shotgun. "I didn't hear you arrive." "Of course you didn't. You were too busy pointing weapons at decent folk." The woman stepped fully inside, uninvited, and Daniel's voice drifted through the open door. "Ma'am? Everything all right in there?" "Everything's fine," Mrs. Hartwell called back, though her tone suggested otherwise. She turned to Rosalie with the expression she usually reserved for sermons about sin and punishment. "That man out there, do you know him?" "No, ma'am. He just arrived. Said his horse needs water." "And you were going to let him have it? A strange man? And you alone with a baby?" Mrs. Hartwell shook her head like Rosalie had suggested dancing with the devil. "Child, you have no sense at all." Henry began crying again, probably sensing the tension in the room. Rosalie bounced him gently, but Mrs. Hartwell reached out and took him before she could protest. The baby quieted in the older woman's experienced arms, and Rosalie felt a familiar stab of inadequacy. "When did you last feed him properly?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, feeling Henry's thin arms through his clothes. "This morning," Rosalie lied. It had been yesterday morning, and even then it was just watered-down milk. "Don't lie to me, girl. I've raised 6 children of my own." Mrs. Hartwell's voice softened slightly as she looked down at Henry. "Poor little thing. He's nothing but skin and bones." Through the window, Rosalie could see Daniel still waiting by the well. He'd removed his hat and was running his fingers through his dark hair, looking uncertain about whether he should leave or stay. His horse stood patiently beside him, still favoring that hurt leg. "Mrs. Hartwell," Rosalie began carefully, "what brings you all the way out here?" The older woman's face grew stern again. "Word reached town about your situation. People are talking, Rosalie. A young woman living alone, no family, no husband. It's not proper." "I'm managing just fine," Rosalie said, lifting her chin the way she always did when people questioned her choices. "Are you? Look around you, child. Look at this baby. You're not managing anything except to slowly starve yourself and him too." Mrs. Hartwell shifted Henry to her other arm. "That's why I'm here. The church has made a decision." Something cold settled in Rosalie's stomach. "What kind of decision?" "There's a family in Kansas City. Good Christian people who've been praying for a child. They're willing to take Henry, give him a proper home with 2 parents and food on the table every day." The words hit Rosalie like a physical blow. "No. Now, don't be selfish about this. Think about what's best for the boy." "I am thinking about him. I'm his sister. I promised our parents." "Your parents are dead, child. And if you keep on like this, Henry will be too." Mrs. Hartwell's words were harsh but not unkind. "You can't feed him. You can't keep him warm. Winter's coming, and this place won't survive another storm." Outside, Daniel had moved closer to the cabin, probably wondering what was taking so long. Rosalie could see him through the window, studying their broken fence and patched walls with the careful eye of someone who understood how quickly things could fall apart on the frontier. "I won't give him up," Rosalie said firmly. "He's all the family I have left. And what happens when he gets sick? When the food runs out completely? When winter freezes you both to death in this broken-down cabin?" Mrs. Hartwell bounced Henry gently as he started to fuss again. "Love doesn't keep children alive, Rosalie. Food and shelter and medicine do." The truth of those words stung worse than the cut on her hand. Rosalie looked around their tiny home, seeing it through Mrs. Hartwell's eyes. The holes in the roof, the empty shelves, the patches and repairs that were failing one by one. How long could she really keep Henry safe here? "Ma'am." Daniel's voice came through the door again. "I don't mean to interrupt, but my horse is getting restless. If you'd rather I move on." "Tell him to come in," Mrs. Hartwell said suddenly. "I want to get a look at this stranger you were so eager to help." Rosalie hesitated. Having Daniel inside with Mrs. Hartwell felt dangerous somehow, like mixing fire and gunpowder. But she couldn't think of a reason to refuse without seeming rude. "You can come in," she called out. But keep your hands where I can see them. The door opened slowly, and Daniel stepped inside, hat in hand. He was taller than she'd realized, and his presence seemed to fill their small cabin. His brown eyes moved quickly around the room, taking in the poverty and disrepair, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Ladies," he said, nodding politely, "I'm Daniel Reed. Sorry to disturb you." Mrs. Hartwell studied him with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. "What's your business here, Mr. Reed?" "Just passing through, ma'am." "Horse through a shoe. Needed water." His gaze moved to Henry in Mrs. Hartwell's arms, and something soft crossed his features. "Beautiful baby." "He's not hers," Mrs. Hartwell said bluntly, and Rosalie felt heat flood her cheeks. "He's my brother," Rosalie said quickly. "Our parents died last spring." Daniel's expression grew sympathetic. "I'm sorry for your loss. That's a heavy burden for someone so young." "Too heavy," Mrs. Hartwell agreed, "which is why the church has found a good family to take him. People who can provide what she can't." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Daniel looked between the two women, clearly sensing the conflict but uncertain whether he should comment. Finally, he spoke directly to Rosalie. "What do you want?" he asked simply. The question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked what she wanted instead of telling her what she should do? "I want to keep my brother safe," she said. "I want to honor the promise I made to our parents. I want—" She stopped, realizing how impossible her wants sounded when spoken aloud. "She wants the impossible," Mrs. Hartwell finished. "She wants to raise a baby alone in a broken cabin with no money and no help. She wants to pretend that good intentions are enough to keep a child alive through a Wyoming winter." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from Henry to Rosalie to the evidence of their desperate situation scattered around the cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "What if she didn't have to do it alone?" Both women stared at him. Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose toward her hairline, while Rosalie felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" Rosalie asked. But before Daniel could answer, Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward, Henry still in her arms, her face set with determination. "I mean, it's time to stop this foolishness and do what's right for this child. The wagon to Kansas City leaves next week, and Henry's going to be on it." The finality in her voice made Rosalie's blood run cold. How far would Mrs. Hartwell go to take Henry away? And what did Daniel Reed mean about not doing it alone? "She can't take Henry." Daniel's words were quiet but firm as he watched Mrs. Hartwell rock the baby. "Not if his sister doesn't want to give him up." Mrs. Hartwell's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "And who are you to have an opinion about it? A drifter who showed up an hour ago? This is a matter for the church and proper authorities." Rosalie felt caught between them like a leaf in a storm. Part of her wanted to snatch Henry back from Mrs. Hartwell's arms, but another part whispered that maybe the older woman was right. Maybe she was being selfish, keeping Henry in this broken place when he could have a real home with people who had enough food and money. "The law says she's his guardian," Daniel continued, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "Parents died and left him to her care. That makes it her choice." "The law," Mrs. Hartwell's eyes flashed. "The law doesn't care about babies starving in cabins that should have been torn down years ago. The law doesn't put food in empty stomachs or medicine in fevered bodies." Henry began to cry again, his thin wail cutting through the tension in the room. Rosalie reached for him automatically, but Mrs. Hartwell turned away, shielding the baby with her body. "Look at him," she said, her voice growing urgent. "Really look. See how thin he is? How weak. Another month of this and there won't be anything left to save." The words hit Rosalie like physical blows because they were true. Henry was thinner than he should be, paler than he'd been even a week ago. His clothes hung loose on his tiny frame, and his cries seemed weaker each day. "I know he's hungry," Rosalie whispered. "I know I'm not. I'm trying my best." "Your best isn't enough," Mrs. Hartwell said, but her tone had softened. "And that's not your fault, child. You're 20 years old, alone with no money and no help. No one could manage this situation. Daniel had been watching this exchange in silence, but now he stepped forward. What if someone offered help? What kind of help? Rosalie asked, though part of her was afraid to hope. I'm heading to Cheyenne for work. Good work, steady pay. Man who hired me mentioned needing someone to help with his household too. Cooking, cleaning, watching his children while he's at the office. Daniel paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. He'd pay fair wages, provide a place to live. Safe place. Mrs. Hartwell snorted. And what's in it for you? Men don't help young women out of the goodness of their hearts. Something flickered across Daniel's face. Pain, maybe, or old regret. Had a sister once. Lost her boy when she died. Always wondered what might have happened if someone had offered to help instead of standing by watching. The simple honesty in his words made Rosalie's chest tight. She could see the truth of old grief in his eyes, the weight of chances not taken and help not offered. You don't even know us, she said. No, but I know what it looks like when someone's drowning. And I know what it feels like to wish you'd thrown them a rope. Daniel looked directly at her. I'm offering you a rope, miss. Question is whether you're willing to grab it. Mrs. Hartwell shifted Henry to her other arm, studying Daniel with new interest. This job in Cheyenne, it's real? Not some story you're telling. Real as the morning sun. Mr. Patterson owns a freight company, needs reliable help. Lost his wife last winter, struggling to manage his business and his 2 young ones. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Got the letter right here if you want to see it. Rosalie stared at the letter like it might bite her. A real job, real pay, a chance to keep Henry and still provide for him properly. It seemed too good to be true, which usually meant it was. What would you get out of this arrangement? She asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Chance to do something right for once. Chance to help instead of just riding by. He paused. And maybe some company on the road. Gets lonely traveling alone. Mrs. Hartwell was reading the letter now, her sharp eyes scanning every word. Hiram Patterson, she murmured. I know that name. Good reputation from what I've heard. Fair man. So you'd vouch for him? Daniel asked. I'd vouch for his name and reputation. Can't vouch for you, though. Don't know you from Adam. Mrs. Hartwell folded the letter carefully. Could be you're exactly what you seem. A decent man offering help. Could be you're something else entirely. The fear that had been lurking in Rosalie's mind stepped forward. What did she really know about Daniel Reed? He seemed kind, seemed honest, but appearances could lie. Stories were full of women who'd trusted the wrong man and paid terrible prices. I need time to think, she said finally. Time's something you don't have much of, Mrs. Hartwell pointed out. Winter's coming fast, and that roof won't hold against the first real storm. As if summoned by her words, wind began to rattle the loose boards around the window. The sky outside had darkened while they'd been talking, and Rosalie could smell rain in the air. Storm's building, Daniel observed, moving to look out the window. Might be a big one, from the look of those clouds. Henry's cries grew louder, and this time when Rosalie reached for him, Mrs. Hartwell let her take him. The baby felt so light in her arms, so fragile. She could feel his ribs through his thin clothes, could see how his tiny face had grown gaunt over the past weeks. If I went with you, she said slowly, speaking to Daniel but looking down at Henry, what would be expected? What would the arrangement be? Honest work for honest pay. Help with cooking and cleaning, watch the children when needed. You and your brother would have your own room, meals provided, decent clothes. Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. Nothing more than that. I'm not looking for a wife or anything else. Just offering passage to a better situation. Mrs. Hartwell was watching this conversation with intense interest. And if she said yes? When would you leave? Soon as the storm passes. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. Daniel looked at Rosalie. But only if she wants to come. Won't force anyone. Thunder rolled across the prairie, closer now, and the first drops of rain began hitting the roof. Within minutes, Water was dripping through the familiar holes, and Rosalie had to move Henry away from the wet spots. "We can't stay here through winter," she admitted quietly. "Not like this." "No," Mrs. Hartwell agreed. "You can't. So the choice is Kansas City with the Church family, or Cheyenne with Mr. Reed here." Two paths stretched before her, both leading away from everything she'd known. One meant giving up Henry to strangers who could provide for him better than she could. The other meant trusting a stranger with both their lives, gambling everything on the hope that Daniel Reed was the decent man he appeared to be. As the storm grew stronger and rain began to fall in earnest through their broken roof, Rosalie realized that doing nothing was no longer an option. The question was which risk to take. The risk of losing Henry forever, or the risk of trusting someone she barely knew. And time was running out to decide. The crash of splintering would split the air as a section of their roof collapsed under the weight of wind and rain, sending Rosalie diving to shield Henry from the falling debris. Water poured through the new hole like a waterfall, soaking everything within seconds and turning their small cabin into a muddy disaster. "Everyone out!" Daniel shouted over the roar of the storm, already moving toward them. "This whole roof's about to come down." Mrs. Hartwell grabbed the baby blanket while Rosalie clutched Henry against her chest, both women stumbling toward the door as another beam groaned ominously overhead. Daniel caught Rosalie's arm as she slipped on the wet floor, steadying her while scanning the cabin for anything worth saving. "My mother's Bible," Rosalie gasped, pointing toward the shelf where water was already dripping onto the leather cover. "And Henry's extra clothes." "I'll get them," Daniel said, releasing her arm. "Get to my horse. He's big enough to block some of the wind." Outside, the storm had turned vicious. Rain drove sideways across the prairie, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Rosalie pressed Henry close to her body, trying to protect him from the worst of it, while Mrs. Hartwell struggled to keep her gray dress from whipping around her legs. Daniel's horse stood remarkably calm despite the chaos, as if storms were nothing new to him. The animal's large body did provide some shelter, and Rosalie huddled against his side while Mrs. Hartwell held the blanket over Henry's small form. "Can't stay out here long," Mrs. Hartwell shouted over the wind. "Baby will catch his death." Daniel emerged from the cabin carrying Rosalie's few precious belongings wrapped in an oilcloth. Behind him, another section of roof sagged dangerously, and she realized with sick certainty that their home was truly destroyed. "Town's 8 miles east," he called out, water streaming from his hat. "We could make it if we ride together." "All of us? On one horse?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice was skeptical. "Done it before. Horse is strong, and we don't have much choice." Daniel was already checking his saddle, making sure everything was secure. "Storm's getting worse, not better." Rosalie looked back at their cabin, what was left of it. Water poured through multiple holes now, and she could see their few pieces of furniture floating in the growing puddle that covered the floor. Everything she and Henry had left of their parents was being washed away by the rain. "The money jar," she said suddenly, remembering the few coins they had left. "Already got it," Daniel said, patting his jacket pocket. "Grabbed it with the Bible." The fact that he'd thought to save their money when she'd forgotten it herself made something warm and grateful bloom in her chest. A stranger caring more about their survival than she had in that moment of panic. "We need to go now," Mrs. Hartwell said urgently. Henry was starting to shiver despite the blanket, and his lips looked pale in the gray light. "This child needs to get warm and dry." Daniel helped Rosalie mount his horse first, showing her how to sit sideways to make room for the others. Then Mrs. Hartwell climbed up behind her, surprisingly spry for a woman her age, with Henry secure between them. Daniel swung up last, taking the reins and wrapping his arms around them all to shield them from the worst of the wind. "Hold tight," he warned. "Going to be a rough ride." The horse moved forward into the storm with steady, careful steps. Daniel kept him at a walk despite the urgency, understanding that a fall in this weather could kill them all. Rain lashed at their faces, and Rosalie could barely see 5 feet ahead through the gray curtain of water. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, having to shout to be heard. "You could have ridden away when the storm started." left us to figure it out ourselves. Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally answered, his voice was rough with emotion she hadn't expected. Told you about my sister. What I didn't say was that I was supposed to help her. Was supposed to come back for her and the boy after I made some money out west. His arms tightened around them as the horse stumbled slightly on the muddy ground. But I stayed away too long, chasing bigger opportunities. By the time I got back, she was dead and the boy was gone. The pain in his voice made Rosalie's chest ache. She understood now why he'd looked at Henry with such careful tenderness, why he'd been so determined to help them. What was his name? She asked softly. Your nephew, Michael. He'd be about 15 now if he's still alive. Don't even know where the orphanage sent him. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Every time I see a boy his age, I wonder if it might be him. Mrs. Hartwell had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. You blame yourself for something that wasn't your fault, she said, her tone gentler than Rosalie had ever heard it. Fever takes people regardless of who's there to help them. Maybe, but I wasn't there to try. Wasn't there when they needed me most. Daniel guided the horse around a fallen tree branch. Won't make that mistake again. Through the rain and wind, Rosalie could make out the faint glow of lights ahead. The town, still miles away but real enough to give her hope. Henry had stopped crying and was sleeping fitfully against her chest. His breathing shallow but steady. What happens when we get to town? She asked. Find somewhere warm and dry first, Daniel replied. Then figure out next steps. Next steps meaning Cheyenne? Only if that's what you want. I'm not going to pressure you into anything. His voice was firm despite having to shout over the storm. Your choice, your brother, your life. Mrs. Hartwell spoke up from behind them. And if she chooses Kansas City instead? Then I'll make sure she gets there safely. Either way, she's not staying in that broken cabin through winter. The simple certainty in his voice made Rosalie feel something she hadn't experienced in months. The sensation of being protected, of having someone else shoulder part of the responsibility that had been weighing her down. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. But as they rode through the storm toward town, one question haunted her. Could she really trust this man with Henry's life and her own future? The hotel room felt like a palace after months in their broken cabin. Even though it was just a simple space with 2 beds and a washstand. Henry was finally warm and dry, sleeping peacefully on a real mattress while Rosalie sat by the window watching the storm rage outside. Mrs. Hartwell had taken the other bed and was snoring softly, exhausted from their harrowing ride to town. Daniel had gotten them this room, paid for it with his own money, then gone to sleep in the stable with his horse. More comfortable there anyway, he'd said when Rosalie protested. Been sleeping rough so long. A real bed would probably keep me awake. Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, she had time to think. Really think, without wind howling or rain dripping or the constant worry about where their next meal would come from. The luxury of stillness felt strange after so many months of crisis. A soft knock at the door made her turn. Miss McKenna? Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Sorry to bother you, but there's something you should know. She opened the door carefully, mindful of the sleeping baby. Daniel stood in the hallway with his hat in his hands, his expression serious in the lamplight. What is it? Just spoke with the hotel clerk. There was a man here yesterday asking questions about you and your brother. Described you both pretty accurately. Daniel's voice was low, concerned. Clerk said he claimed to be family. Said he was worried about your welfare. Ice ran down Rosalie's spine. What did this man look like? Tall, thin, well-dressed. City clothes. Had papers with him, official-looking. Daniel watched her face carefully. You know who that might be? She did know, and the knowledge made her feel sick. Uncle Marcus. My father's brother from back east. He came to the funeral, tried to convince me to give up the homestead then. Said a young woman had no business trying to manage property. What kind of papers would he have? Legal ones, probably. He's a lawyer. Rosalie's hands were shaking now. He could claim I'm an unfit guardian. Take Henry away through the courts. Mrs. Hartwell stirred on the bed behind them, then sat up with the alertness of someone who'd learned to wake quickly when trouble called. "What's going on?" she asked, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. Rosalie explained about Uncle Marcus while dread settled in her stomach like a stone. She'd thought the worst threat to Henry's welfare was poverty and isolation. She hadn't considered that family members might use the law against them. "A lawyer with legal papers," Mrs. Hartwell mused. "That's different from church intervention. That's serious trouble." "How serious?" Rosalie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Serious enough that staying in town might not be safe," Daniel said quietly. "If he's got court orders, local sheriff would have to enforce them." Mrs. Hartwell was fully awake now, her sharp mind working through the implications. "But if you were married, Rosalie, that would change things. Married women have different legal standing, especially with their husband's support." The suggestion hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Rosalie felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. There's no one," she stammered. "There could be," Mrs. Hartwell said, looking meaningfully at Daniel. "Quick ceremony, practical arrangement. Wouldn't be the first frontier marriage born of necessity rather than romance." Daniel's face had gone very still. "That's not why I offered to help," he said carefully. "Don't want Miss McKenna thinking I had ulterior motives." "What do you want?" Rosalie asked him directly, echoing his question from the cabin. "Really want, He was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he looked up, his brown eyes were honest and tired. "Want to do something right for once. Want to help instead of walking away. Want to stop carrying guilt about the people I couldn't save." He paused. "And maybe I want to stop being alone all the time." The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. Here was a man offering not romance or passion, but partnership. Shared responsibility. A chance for both of them to be less alone in a world that was often harsh to people without family or connections. "It would be a marriage of convenience," Mrs. Hartwell said practically. "Business arrangement. Both of you would benefit. She gets protection from relatives trying to take her brother, you get a family and steady work. Could grow into more over time or stay as it started. Plenty of frontier marriages work that way." Henry stirred in his sleep, making the soft sounds babies make when they're dreaming. Rosalie looked at his tiny face, thinking about Uncle Marcus and his legal papers, about the long winter ahead, about the choice between Kansas City strangers and this man who'd saved their money jar without being asked. "What about the job in Cheyenne?" she asked. "Would Mr. Patterson still hire a married man?" "Might work better, actually. Married man with a family seems more settled, more reliable." Daniel's voice was thoughtful. "And you'd still be helping with his household, just as his employee's wife instead of a hired girl living in his house." It made practical sense, which was exactly what frightened her about it. Marriage should be about love, shouldn't it? About choosing someone because your heart demanded it, not because lawyers were chasing you with court papers. But then she thought about her parents, who'd married young out of necessity when her father needed help with his homestead. They'd grown to love each other deeply over the years, building something real from practical beginnings. "If we did this," she said slowly, "what would you expect from me? As a wife?" "Companionship," Daniel said simply. "Someone to talk to at the end of long days. Someone who won't disappear when times get hard." He hesitated. "Everything else, that would be up to you when and if you ever wanted it." The respect in his voice, the way he put the choice in her hands, made something warm unfurl in her chest. Maybe marriage didn't have to mean giving up control of her own life. Maybe it could mean sharing the burden instead of carrying it alone. But as she looked at Henry sleeping peacefully on the hotel bed, one crucial question remained. Was she brave enough to trust their future to a man she'd known for less than 2 days? "The preacher's already here," Mrs. Hartwell announced, bursting through the hotel room door with barely a knock. "And your uncle's downstairs in the lobby, demanding to see you immediately." Rosalie's blood turned to ice water. She clutched Henry closer to her chest, feeling the baby's warm weight as the only real thing in a world that suddenly seemed to be spinning too fast. Through the thin hotel walls, She could hear heavy footsteps on the stairs and a man's voice arguing with the desk clerk. "How long do we have?" Daniel asked, moving to the window to check the alley below. "Minutes, maybe less." Mrs. Hartwell was already gathering their few belongings. "He's got papers from a judge in Kansas. Says you're an unfit guardian living in immoral conditions." "Immoral?" Rosalie's voice came out as a squeak. "Unmarried woman living alone. No visible means of support. Child obviously malnourished." Mrs. Hartwell's tone was brisk but sympathetic. "He's painting a picture that would convince most judges." The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer, and Rosalie could make out Uncle Marcus's voice now, cold and authoritative as he questioned other guests about seeing a young woman with a baby. Her hands started shaking so badly she was afraid she might drop Henry. "We could run," she whispered. "Where?" Daniel asked gently. "He's got the law on his side now. Running would just make you look guilty." "Then what do we do?" Mrs. Hartwell straightened her shoulders like a general preparing for battle. "We get you married. Right now. Before he reaches this door." The knock came then, sharp and demanding. "Rosalie? I know you're in there. Open this door immediately." Daniel stepped closer to her, his voice low and urgent. "It's your choice. But if you want to do this, we need to decide now." Henry began to cry, perhaps sensing the tension in the room, and Rosalie found herself looking down into his small face. Uncle Marcus would take him away to some distant city, give him to strangers who might be kind or might not be. She'd never see him again, never know if he was safe or happy or if he even remembered having a sister who loved him. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's do it." Mrs. Hartwell was already moving, opening the door just wide enough to slip through. "Marcus Whitfield," they heard her say in her most commanding voice, "you're making quite a disturbance for a man who claims to be concerned about family welfare." "Mrs. Hartwell, I should have known you'd be involved in this nonsense." Uncle Marcus's voice was smooth and educated, but with an edge that made Rosalie's skin crawl. "Where is my niece? I have legal documents requiring her immediate cooperation. She's indisposed at the moment, getting dressed for her wedding." The silence that followed was so complete Rosalie could hear her own heartbeat. Then Uncle Marcus spoke again, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Her what? Wedding. To a fine young man with steady employment. Taking place in 5 minutes downstairs in the hotel parlor." Mrs. Hartwell's tone was sweetly triumphant. "I'm sure a lawyer like yourself understands that marriage changes a woman's legal status considerably." Daniel was moving around the room with quiet efficiency, gathering their things while keeping one ear on the conversation outside. He caught Rosalie's eye and mouthed silently, "Ready?" She nodded, though nothing about this felt ready. Getting married in a hotel room while hiding from family members with legal papers wasn't exactly how she'd imagined her wedding day. But then again, nothing about her life had gone according to plan since her parents died. "This is ridiculous," Uncle Marcus was saying. "A hasty marriage to avoid legal obligations? No judge will recognize such an obvious fraud." "Won't be fraud if it's real," Mrs. Hartwell replied smoothly. "And I'm sure your niece's new husband will be happy to discuss the situation with you man to man." Daniel straightened at that, his jaw setting in a way that made him look less gentle and more dangerous. Rosalie realized she'd never seen him angry before, but the protective look in his eyes as he listened to Uncle Marcus's threats made her feel safer than she had in months. "We should go," he said quietly, "before he decides to break down the door." They slipped out through the back window onto a small balcony, Daniel helping Rosalie climb down first with Henry, then dropping their bags before swinging down himself. The alley was muddy from the storm but empty, and they made their way around to the hotel's front entrance. Inside the small parlor, a nervous-looking young preacher waited with his Bible. He couldn't have been much older than Rosalie herself, and his hands shook slightly as he opened the book. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, looking between them uncertainly. "I mean, it's not my place to question, but this seems rather sudden." "Love often is," Mrs. Hartwell said firmly from behind them. She'd managed to get downstairs ahead of Uncle Marcus, though Rosalie could hear his voice echoing from the upper floors as he searched the rooms. The preacher nodded and began the ceremony with hurried words about love and honor and commitment. Rosalie found herself staring at Daniel's hands as he took hers. Rough from work but gentle, steady where hers were trembling. He was really doing this, binding his life to theirs without knowing what kind of person she truly was, whether she could be a good wife or if Henry would be too much trouble. Do you, Daniel Reed, take Rosalie McKenna to be your lawful wedded wife? I do, Daniel said, his voice calm and sure. Do you, Rosalie McKenna, take Daniel Reed to be your lawful wedded husband? She looked up into his brown eyes, seeing kindness there, and resolve, and something that might have been hope. Henry had stopped crying and was looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity of babies discovering new places. I do, she whispered. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hotel stairs just as the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Uncle Marcus appeared in the parlor doorway, his face red with anger and frustration, legal papers clutched in his white-knuckled fist. Too late, Mrs. Hartwell said with satisfaction. She's a married woman now. Different laws apply. But as Uncle Marcus's cold eyes fixed on Daniel with calculating intensity, Rosalie realized their troubles might be just beginning. What else might her uncle do to get Henry back? This marriage is a sham, and I'll prove it in court. Uncle Marcus's voice cut through the parlor like a blade, his lawyer's mind already working on ways to challenge what he'd just witnessed. Hasty ceremonies performed to avoid legal obligations rarely hold up under scrutiny. Daniel stepped slightly in front of Rosalie, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. The marriage is legal and witnessed. What's your objection to your niece finding happiness? Happiness? Uncle Marcus laughed, a cold sound that made Henry whimper. She's a child herself, living in poverty, unable to provide basic necessities. This baby belongs with people who can give him proper care and education. Define proper, Daniel said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Uncle Marcus studied him with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to finding weaknesses in his opponents. You're a drifter, aren't you? No permanent address, no steady income. Hardly suitable to raise a child. I have steady work waiting in Cheyenne. Good pay, respectable employer. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter from Mr. Patterson. Feel free to verify the details. While Uncle Marcus read the letter with obvious skepticism, Rosalie found herself watching Daniel's face. There was something different about him now. Less of the gentle uncertainty she'd seen before, more of the quiet strength that had helped them through the storm. Marriage, even a hasty one born of necessity, seemed to have awakened something protective in him. Freight company work, Uncle Marcus said dismissively, handing back the letter. Manual labor. Hardly the environment for raising a gentleman. Henry's not a gentleman yet, Rosalie said, finding her voice at last. He's a baby who needs love and care, not fancy manners. Love doesn't put food on the table or shoes on feet. Uncle Marcus turned his attention back to her, his expression softening into what might have been genuine concern if she hadn't known him better. Rosalie, be reasonable. I'm offering Henry a real future. Education, opportunities, connections that could serve him well in life. With people I've never met, in a place I've never been. Rosalie shifted Henry to her other arm, feeling the solid warmth of his small body. He's my brother. My responsibility. A responsibility you've clearly failed to manage. Uncle Marcus gestured toward Henry's thin frame. Look at him, Rosalie. Really look. When did you last have money for a doctor? For proper food? For clothes that fit? The questions hit like physical blows because they were true. She had failed to provide adequately for Henry. She had watched him grow thinner and paler while telling herself that love would be enough. Mrs. Hartwell spoke up from her corner. The child's situation has been difficult, yes. But now he has two people to care for him instead of one. That changes everything. Does it? Uncle Marcus's gaze fixed on Daniel again. Tell me, Mr. Reed, what do you know about raising children? About the daily care an infant requires? Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Rosalie felt her heart sink. He didn't know anything about babies, Why would he? He was a single man who'd spent his life on the trail. I know that children need safety, Daniel said finally. They need people who won't abandon them when things get difficult. They need to know someone cares whether they live or die. His voice grew rougher. I know what it feels like to be a child with no one, and I won't let that happen to Henry. The raw honesty in his words made Uncle Marcus blink. For the first time since entering the parlor, the older man seemed uncertain. This is all very touching, he said after a pause. But sentiment doesn't change the facts. You're still a couple with no money, no permanent home, and no experience raising children. We'll learn, Rosalie said firmly. Together. And if you fail? If the baby gets sick, or hurt, or worse? Uncle Marcus leaned forward, pressing his advantage. What then? How will you live with yourselves? The question hung in the air like smoke, choking and persistent. Rosalie felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders, the terrible responsibility of another person's life, the possibility of failing again, of watching Henry suffer because of her stubborn determination to keep him. But then Daniel's hand found hers, steady and warm, and she felt some of that weight shift. She wasn't carrying it alone anymore. If we fail, Daniel said quietly, at least we'll fail together, and at least Henry will know he was wanted, that someone fought to keep him safe. Uncle Marcus studied them both for a long moment, his lawyer's mind clearly calculating odds and options. Finally, he folded his legal papers with sharp, precise movements. This isn't over, he said. I'll be watching, and at the first sign that this arrangement isn't working, at the first indication that the child is suffering, I'll be back with more papers and more authority. You do that, Mrs. Hartwell said sweetly, and we'll be sure to document how well they're managing as a family. Uncle Marcus straightened his coat and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at Rosalie. For just a moment, his expression showed something that might have been genuine caring. I hope you know what you're doing, niece. For the boy's sake. After he left, the parlor seemed to echo with unspoken fears and uncertain hopes. Rosalie looked down at Henry, who had fallen asleep in her arms during the confrontation, his small face peaceful despite the chaos around him. What happens now? She asked. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. Now we go to Cheyenne and prove him wrong. But as they gathered their few belongings and prepared to leave town, Rosalie couldn't shake the feeling that Uncle Marcus's threat was real, and that their new family would have to be stronger than any of them knew how to be. Could three strangers really become the family Henry needed? Or were they just delaying the inevitable? The wagon wheel cracked with a sound like breaking bones, sending their small cart tilting dangerously to one side as Henry's cries pierced the morning air. They were still 50 miles from Cheyenne, traveling the dusty road that stretched endlessly across the Wyoming plains, when their borrowed wagon decided to give up completely. Whoa there, Daniel called to the horse, pulling the reins tight as the animal danced nervously at the sudden change. Rosalie clutched Henry against her chest, feeling the baby's frightened trembling match her own as the wagon settled into an awkward lean. They'd been traveling for 3 days since leaving the hotel, making slow progress with their patched-together supplies and the old wagon Daniel had traded for in town. Every mile had brought new challenges, fording swollen creeks, navigating muddy roads, and sleeping under canvas while autumn winds grew colder each night. Can you fix it? Rosalie asked, though she could see from Daniel's expression that the news wasn't good. He climbed down and examined the broken wheel, running his hands over the splintered wood with the careful attention of someone who'd fixed many things in his life. The metal rim had twisted completely away from the wooden spokes, and several boards had split beyond any hope of repair. Not with what we've got, he admitted. This wheel's finished. Henry's cries grew louder, and Rosalie realized he was hungry again. Their food supplies were running low faster than expected, partly because she'd been eating more now that Daniel insisted she have proper meals. Her body was still learning to trust that food would be available tomorrow. How far to the next town? She asked, trying to keep panic out of her voice. 20 miles, maybe 25. Daniel looked up at the sun, calculating time and distance. Too far to walk with a baby, especially if this weather turns. Dark clouds were building on the western horizon, promising another storm. The wind already carried the smell of rain, and Rosalie could feel the temperature dropping as shadows raced across the prairie grass. Daniel unhitched the horse and began sorting through their belongings, deciding what was essential and what could be left behind. Their few precious possessions looked pitifully small spread out on the ground. Henry's clothes, the Bible, their cooking pot, and the small bag of coins that represented their entire fortune. "We could ride double again," Rosalie suggested, remembering their escape from the storm. "Could try, but not for 20 miles. Horse is tired, and carrying 3 people that far might break him down too." Daniel's voice was thoughtful, working through options the way he seemed to approach every problem, methodically, without panic. A distant sound made them both look up. Coming toward them across the plains was another wagon, this one larger and in better repair than theirs had been. As it grew closer, Rosalie could make out a family. Man and woman on the front seat, several children visible in the back. "Help, maybe," Daniel said, stepping into the road to flag them down. The approaching wagon slowed, and Rosalie found herself studying the family with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to judge people quickly. The man looked weathered and practical, his clothes worn but clean. The woman beside him had kind eyes and the soft look of someone who'd borne and raised children successfully. "Trouble?" the man called out as he brought his wagon to a stop. "We'll gave out," Daniel replied, "wondering if you might know the nearest place to get it fixed." The man climbed down to examine their broken wheel, and his wife looked at Rosalie with the immediate sympathy of one mother recognizing another's struggles. Henry had quieted in Rosalie's arms, but she could feel his small body trembling with hunger and cold. "I'm Sarah Coleman," the woman said. "This is my husband James. Those are our children in the back. Emma, Michael, and little Thomas." "Daniel Reed," Daniel replied. "This is my wife Rosalie and her brother Henry." The words still sounded strange to Rosalie's ears. Wife, as if she'd suddenly become someone different from the frightened girl who'd been chopping kindling alone just a week ago. James was shaking his head over their wheel. "Won't be fixing this one. Would split too bad and the metal's bent. You'd need a whole new wheel." "How much would that cost?" Daniel asked, though Rosalie could see he was already calculating their small supply of coins against the expense. "More than you've probably got," James said bluntly but not unkindly. "New wheel like this would run $8–10 at least." $10. More than half their money, leaving them almost nothing for food or lodging when they reached Cheyenne. Rosalie felt despair settling in her stomach like a cold stone. But Sarah Coleman was studying them with the sharp eyes of a woman who'd seen hard times herself. "Where are you folks headed?" "Cheyenne," Daniel replied. "I've got work waiting there. We're going that direction ourselves. Could take you along if you don't mind crowded quarters." Sarah looked at her husband, and some silent communication passed between them. "Course, we'd expect you to help with driving and camp chores." "We can work," Rosalie said quickly. "Both of us. We're not looking for charity." James was nodding slowly. "Could use an extra man for the river crossings ahead. And Sarah's been wanting another woman to talk to." He grinned at his wife. "Gets tired of just us menfolk for company." It was an offer that would solve their immediate problem, but Rosalie found herself hesitating. Traveling with strangers meant exposing Henry to whatever illnesses their children might carry. It meant trusting their safety to people they'd known for 5 minutes. It meant being grateful and polite when all she wanted was to find a quiet place to figure out this new life without an audience. But as the first drops of rain began to fall and Henry started crying again, she realized they didn't have much choice. "That's very kind of you," Daniel said. "We'd be grateful for the help." As they transferred their belongings to the Coleman wagon, Rosalie caught glimpses of the family's life. Well-fed children, sturdy clothes, a sense of security that came from having enough of everything. Emma, who looked about 14, immediately offered to help with Henry, showing the easy competence of a girl who'd helped raise younger siblings. "He's beautiful," Emma said, tickling Henry's tiny hand. "How old is he?" 8 months, Rosalie replied, watching carefully as the girl interacted with her brother. Emma's touch was gentle and confident, and Henry seemed to respond to her cheerful energy. "I helped raise Thomas," Emma continued. "Babies are easier than people think, once you know their signals." The casual confidence in her voice made Rosalie feel both grateful and inadequate. Here was a child who knew more about caring for babies than she did, simply by growing up in a family that worked together. As they settled into the crowded wagon and began moving again, Rosalie found herself studying the Coleman family dynamics. James and Sarah worked together with easy partnership, making decisions jointly and supporting each other's authority with the children. The kids bickered occasionally, but with the comfortable familiarity of siblings who knew they were loved. It was everything she'd never had with Henry: the security of multiple adults, the help of older children, the assumption that there would always be enough food and warmth and safety to go around. "You folks been married long?" Sarah asked as they bounced along the muddy road. "Just a few days," Rosalie admitted, then felt compelled to explain. "It was sudden." Sarah's knowing smile suggested she'd heard that story before. Sometimes the best marriages start that way. Less time to overthink, more time to just trust your instincts. She bounced little Thomas on her knee. "James and I knew each other 3 weeks before we wed. Been 15 years now, and I still think I got the better end of the bargain." The easy affection between the couple was obvious in the way Sarah's hand rested on her husband's arm, the way James made sure she was comfortable before settling himself. Rosalie wondered if she and Daniel would ever have that kind of natural partnership, or if they'd always feel like strangers pretending to be a family. As evening approached and they made camp beside a small creek, Rosalie watched Daniel help James with the horses while she worked alongside Sarah preparing supper. Henry was fussing again, and Emma took him without being asked, walking him around the camp while humming a soft lullaby. "She's good with him," Sarah observed, following Rosalie's worried gaze. "Better than I am, sometimes," Rosalie admitted. "Doubt that. Babies know their mothers. He settles different for you than for anyone else." Sarah handed her a plate of beans and cornbread, more food than Rosalie had seen in weeks. "But accepting help doesn't make you less of a mother. Makes you smarter." The words hit deeper than Sarah probably intended. For months, Rosalie had equated accepting help with failure, independence with love. But watching Emma expertly calm Henry while she helped prepare food for everyone, she began to wonder if she'd been thinking about it all wrong. Maybe being a good mother meant building a community around Henry, not trying to be everything to him herself. Maybe trust wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the foundation that let families grow strong. But as she watched Daniel laughing with James over some shared joke by the fire, one question nagged at her. Was what they were building together real enough to last? Or would it all fall apart the moment they faced real challenges in Cheyenne? The freight yard in Cheyenne bustled with more activity than Rosalie had ever seen in one place. Men loading wagons and shouting orders while horses stamped and harnesses jingled in the crisp morning air. She stood beside the Coleman wagon, clutching Henry close as she watched Daniel disappear into the crowd of workers, searching for Mr. Patterson and the job that would determine their future. "Impressive place," James Coleman said, surveying the organized chaos of the freight company. "Patterson's got a good operation here. Must employ 30, 40 men." Sarah was gathering their children, preparing for the final leg of their journey to their own homestead north of town. After 5 days of traveling together, Rosalie felt like she was losing family just when she discovered what family could be. "You'll be fine," Sarah said, squeezing Rosalie's free hand. "That husband of yours has a good head on his shoulders, and you're stronger than you think." Emma hugged both Rosalie and Henry goodbye, whispering advice about teething and feeding schedules that Rosalie tried desperately to remember. The teenager had taught her more about caring for babies in 5 days than she'd learned in 8 months of struggling alone. "Write to us," Sarah insisted, pressing a piece of paper with their address into Rosalie's hand. "Let us know how you're settling." As the Coleman wagon rolled away, Rosalie felt a familiar knot of loneliness forming in her chest. For a few days, she'd experienced what it was like to be part of something larger than herself and Henry. Now they were alone again, strangers in a strange place, waiting to learn if their desperate gamble had paid off. Daniel emerged from the crowd with a tall, bearded man who moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. Hiram Patterson was younger than Rosalie had expected, probably not much older than Daniel himself, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mrs. Reed," he said, touching his hat politely. "Welcome to Cheyenne. I'm Hiram Patterson." The formal introduction felt strange after days of casual conversation with the Colemans. Rosalie shifted Henry to her other arm and tried to look like the kind of responsible woman who deserved steady employment. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Patterson. We're grateful for the work." "Well, we'll see how grateful you are after you meet my children," Patterson said with a tired smile. "Been managing on my own since Mary died, and I'm afraid the house shows it." He led them through the freight yard to a two-story house that sat on a small rise overlooking the business. It was larger than any place Rosalie had ever lived, with real glass windows and painted shutters, but even from a distance she could see signs of neglect. Overgrown garden, peeling paint, laundry hanging crooked on the line. "Lucy's 8 and Billy's 5, Patterson explained as they walked. "Good children, but they need more attention than I can give while running the business. Lucy's been trying to manage the household, but she's too young for such responsibility." Rosalie thought of herself at 20, feeling overwhelmed by caring for one baby, and her heart went out to an 8-year-old girl trying to run an entire household. The front door opened before they reached it, and two children appeared, a serious-faced girl with brown braids and a boy who hung back shyly behind his sister. Lucy Patterson had the careful expression of a child who'd grown up too fast, while Billy looked like he'd been crying recently. "Lucy, Billy, this is Mr. and Mrs. Reed," Patterson said. "They're going to be helping us for a while." Lucy studied them with the sharp attention of someone used to evaluating adults' trustworthiness. Her gaze lingered on Henry, and something soft flickered across her features. "Is that your baby?" she asked. "My brother," Rosalie replied. "His name is Henry." "He's little," Billy said, stepping closer with the fascination children have for anything smaller than themselves. Patterson was watching this interaction carefully. Lucy's been worried about having strangers in the house. She's very protective of Billy. Rosalie could see the weight of responsibility in the girl's young shoulders, the way she positioned herself between her brother and the unknown adults. It was a posture she recognized from her own reflection, someone trying to be strong enough to protect the people they loved. "That's smart of her," Rosalie said, addressing Lucy directly. "Looking out for family is the most important job there is." Something in her tone must have reassured the girl, because Lucy's rigid stance relaxed slightly. Inside, the house revealed the truth of a man trying to manage too much alone. The rooms were clean but cluttered, with children's clothes folded in uneven piles and dishes stacked haphazardly in the kitchen. Everything was functional but lacked the organization that came from a woman's touch. "Your room's upstairs," Patterson said, leading them to a spacious bedroom with a window overlooking the freight yard. "Figured you'd want space for the baby's things." The room was larger than their entire cabin had been, with a real bed and a dresser and even a small chair by the window. Rosalie set Henry down on the bed and watched him look around with wide eyes, taking in more space and comfort than he'd ever known. "What exactly would you need me to do?" she asked. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry. Managing the household so Lucy can just be a child again." Patterson's voice grew gruff with emotion. "Maybe help with the children's schooling. Lucy's smart as a whip, but she's missed too much helping me. And Daniel? I need a man I can trust to handle the books, deal with customers, oversee loading crews. Someone who can think ahead and solve problems." Patterson looked directly at Daniel. "Job comes with good pay and a share of profits if business stays strong." It sounded too good to be true, which in Rosalie's experience usually meant it was. But looking around the house, seeing the evidence of a family struggling to hold together after loss, she began to understand why Patterson was offering so much. "When would we start?" Daniel asked. "Tomorrow if you're willing. Got a big shipment heading out to Denver, and I need someone reliable managing the details." Patterson paused. "But I want to be clear about expectations. This isn't charity, it's a business arrangement. I need people I can depend on, especially with my children involved. We understand, Rosalie said, though part of her wondered if they really did. Could she manage a household this size? Could she help raise 2 children who'd already lost their mother while still learning to care for Henry? There's something else, Patterson continued, his expression growing serious. Mary's been gone 6 months now, and people in town have opinions about a widower hiring a young married couple. Some might assume, well, they might make assumptions that could damage reputations. The warning was clear. Their arrangement would be scrutinized, judged, possibly condemned by people who didn't understand the practical realities of frontier life. Let them talk, Daniel said firmly. We're here to work and build a life. What others think about it is their business. Patterson nodded approvingly. Good attitude, but be prepared. Small towns have long memories and sharp tongues. As they settled into their new room that evening, unpacking their few belongings in the largest space they'd ever had, Rosalie felt the weight of all the expectations resting on their shoulders. Patterson needed them to succeed. Lucy and Billy needed stability. Henry needed safety and security. And somewhere in the distance, Uncle Marcus was probably watching and waiting for them to fail. Think we can do this? She asked Daniel as they stood at the window, watching the last light fade over the freight yard. We have to, he replied simply. Too many people counting on us to give up now. But as she looked out at the unfamiliar town that would either become their home or the place where their dreams fell apart, one question echoed in her mind. Could a marriage born of desperation really provide the foundation for the family they were all trying to build?